Okay, day 526 of the apocalypse. Action.
Hello, it's John Heaton. Today I'm going to do part 3 of my Beatles book series, and this part 3 is going to cover insiders, so wives, girlfriends, assistants, employees, anyone like that who's written a book that might feature in this list. So it's not a comprehensive list, it's just the stuff taken from my collection. And before I get on to that, it's going to be a top 10. Before I get on to that, I just want to mention a couple of things that I forgot in my previous reviews. So on the Beatles section, I didn't actually mention Hunter Davis's book, which is obviously the first and the only authorised biography. Came out in 1968. It's pretty enjoyable as far as it goes, and some good material, although they left out some of the juicy bits. Some good material, particularly regarding the creative process around 1967 during the recording of Sgt. Pepper, so that's worth investigating. These books from John Lennon himself, got two versions actually. Two books which came out in 64-65 in his own right, and Spaniard in the works. And I just want to read you an excerpt from the Fat Budgie, because I spotted two lines from future solo songs in this poem, which is quite interesting. See if you can spot them. The last two verses of the Fat Budgie. It would be funny, wouldn't it? A budgie on a stick. Imagine all the people laughing till they're sick. So that's my budgie Geoffrey, fat and yellow too. I love him more than Daddy, and I'm only 32. Good stuff, John. Right, where are we? And another one, a Beatles book by Wilfred Mellors. I don't have the book because it's got lost in the mist of time. But Twilight of the Gods, music of the Beatles. Superb book, very technical. Goes into all the chord changes and the B7s and minor sixths and everything, but interesting, very interesting book. So, now, insiders, top 10. Well, at number 10 I put Cynthia's book, A Twist of Lennon, which came out during Lennon's lifetime, and it was it's okay, particularly good, covering the early years, the pre-fame years, because they met at art school and got married round about the start of Beatlemania, so particularly good covering the earlier period. Some of the later stuff, that you can tell that she and John are not as close, so she doesn't have that many insights on the 67-68 period, but good stuff. Patty, number 9. This book came out a few years ago and covers her reminiscences of George and Eric and everyone else she came across, and it's very entertaining. Good pictures, well written. And Patty actually used to live in Wimbledon, which is where I grew up, so good stuff. And then we had Chris O'Dell, who worked at Apple, and this book came out a couple of years ago as well. And it's called Miss O'Dell because it's a track by George Harrison. It was a B-side of Give Me Love 73, written about Chris O'Dell. And she was in a very fortunate position, not only working for the Beatles, but seemed to have backstage passes for most of the top musicians and concerts of the time. And she was actually around at the time of the rooftop concert, and I think she might have even been there, but she doesn't cover it in nearly enough detail in this book. That's a minor criticism. But nice one, Chris. Good book. That's number 8. And then number 7 we have Linda's Pictures, a book of pictures by Linda McCartney, which came out, I think it was 77. Obviously you recognise the front cover there, the McCartney album cover, and there's some brilliant pictures in here. I'll show you a few. This is the famous one at Brian Epstein's house. At the launch of Sgt. Pepper, we've got an interesting one of a business meeting with Alan Klein, with John and Paul towards the end. We have an interesting picture of the Beatles with Yoko there. And then possibly one of my favourite Beatles pictures ever, sitting on the steps of EMI just before shooting the album cover for Abbey Road. That is a brilliant picture, and I don't think I've seen that picture in any other book other than Linda's pictures. So that was number 7. Number 6, Anthony Fawcett. There's a few Lennon books coming up here. Anthony Fawcett was a personal assistant to John and Yoko, late 60s, early 70s, and this is a very good book, particularly good covering the breakup, the Beatles breakup. It kind of recounts, I think he must have been in a couple of meetings towards the end where they're talking about how they're going to share out the tracks after Abbey Road and try and agree, on who should get what. And I don't know how much of it is slightly sort of fabricated or not fabricated. I'm not sure if it's verbatim what happened, but I think he was pretty close to the scene at the time, so I've no reason to doubt it. This is a very interesting set of pictures with even Paul seemingly having a laugh with Alan Klein there. Very good. Good book. That was number 6. Number 5, Fredrik Seaman, who was an assistant to John the last 2 and a bit years, I think it was, of his life, or maybe 2 years. So he was with John in Bermuda when he wrote the tracks for Double Fantasy, and it's a very good book. It's just, you have to take it with a bit of a pinch of salt because he's got a bit of an agenda, a bit of an anti-Yoko slant on this book. But I think I can tell what I choose to believe what I think to be true, and the rest I just ignore. But there's some great stuff in here. It's a great book, and it's not half as scurrilous and nasty as Albert Goldman's book or some of the other similar type books. This one's altogether more affectionate, although it does have its negative side and calls him a troubled man and saying he was tormented and all the rest of it. But for the good bits, I recommend it. And then so that was number 5. Number 4 from May Pang, Loving John, superb book admittedly covering only a limited period like the other one, but for the period that it does cover, which is basically 73-74 in immense detail, the period that John spent in Los Angeles recording Walls and Bridges, that was later in New York, and in LA recording Goodnight Vienna with Ringo, and hanging out with Keith Moon and Harry Nilsson, and very productive period of his life artistically, although later on he was to somehow somewhat distance himself from it. He meets Paul McCartney quite a bit in this book. He meets David Bowie, and I enjoy this book, and I even go back to it quite often. Here is John with Elton. So yeah, nice one, May. And then number 3 we have Richard DeLalo, who worked at Apple. I think he was in Derek Taylor's press office. There's a picture of him there in the back with his massive perm. Very amusing book, covering the last couple of years of the Beatles' career. So it's a little bit depressing because it's kind of when they were splitting up. But as with the other best Beatles books, it's written with a lot of humour, and so one can even laugh at a tragedy as it's unfolding. That was number 3. Number 2, Peter Brown, who worked for the Beatles pretty much throughout the 60s, and he wrote this book, The Love You Make, came out in 1983, and I know Paul didn't like it. Apparently he burned his copy on the bonfire. It's a little bit, comes across as a little bit anti-Paul, this book. There's some criticism I would make, but very well written and very entertainingly written, and it's just a joy to read. And he really was an insider. He close to pretty much all four Beatles during the years that they were at the top, and so he has a lot of insights and stories to tell, not just from the early period, but going to Greece to try and buy an island during the psychedelia of '67, Magic Alex, the arrival of Yoko, just good stuff. So that brings us to number one, and I don't actually have number one anymore because I lost it. But it's a book called Waiting for the Beatles by Carol Bedford, who was one of the original Apple Scruffs. And so this is basically a fan's story. And because she was an Apple Scruff, as you may know, Apple Scruffs managed to meet the Beatles on more than one occasion. And she particularly grew close to George. And this book is just full of very intimate and nice reminiscing of her time waiting for the Beatles. And if I'd been 17 or 18 in the late 60s, I might have been an Apple Scruff myself, although they seem to have been all women, so I would have stuck out as the only man maybe. But anyway, in another life perhaps. So that was my top 10 Beatles books by insiders. Thanks for watching. See you next time.